Good morning, biology students. It's Mr. Olson. I think today is day 29 of our distance learning. We have 5 weeks of school left, and so hopefully you are getting excited for that, but also trying to do your best over the next 5 weeks to make sure that you've taken care of business while you're in school. Okay. So this week we're going to be talking about what are called bio meaning life, geo meaning rocks, chemical, well, meaning chemical cycles. So biogeochemical cycles. Okay. We're going to come back to this in a second. I do want to let you know um, kind of what we're following up with here with your final project. And this will be our final project in biology. It's what you've been working on, our biology out of school project. This will be your essentially your final, right? And so you're going to finish up your final project over the next 5 weeks, and you'll submit that, and that'll be your final for the biology class, okay? And that'll be worth 10% of your grade, as you know, okay? Hopefully, you've been plugging away on this. The thing that I think is worth noting is like I said, we're going to be weaving our way through this project while we learn new things. And so we just got finished talking about biomes and biotic and abiotic factors. This is when I want you to now get this part of your project done. So bullet point number 5 or slide 5 about habitat of your organism. I want pictures and information, geographic location. Maps are always nice. You could tell us where it's at, but if you have a map showing where your organism is located, that's always helpful. The biome of where it's located. I want to know if your organism occupies the tundra, temperate forests, rainforest. I want to know where where your organism can be found. And so make sure that you write down and give me information on the biome. And then abiotic factors. What's rainfall like? What are the temperatures like there? Those are things that matter in an ecosystem. And I want to make sure that I understand that and that you understand that. So make sure you include those things. And then endangerment. If your organism's endangered, you can talk about that here. If your organism is endangered because of human impact, do it in the human impact section, okay? So if deforestation is the reason your organism is endangered, that's a human issue, right? That's something humans are doing. Occasionally, there is endangerment that's not human driven, and so you can talk about that there if that's the case. But a lot of times, um, humans are having a huge impact on what might be causing the endangerment. So talk about that there, okay? Um, let's talk about biogeochemical cycles for a minute, okay? So with biogeochemical cycles, um, we're looking at the flow of water, carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus. You remember CHNOPS or CHOMPS, CHNOPS? These are the elements vital for life. And so for us to understand life and how living things are getting what they need, we have to look at and track the movement of things like water and carbon and nitrogen and phosphorus, okay? And so let's start with the water cycle. This should be familiar to you, right? There's really three components of the water cycle that I want you guys knowing, okay? It starts with evaporation, okay? Evaporation, so as the sun is heating up water wherever, typically the ocean, but any sort of body of water, as the sun heats up things like the ocean, it causes that water on the ocean to evaporate, right? And so you have this warm air and water rising, right? You know, heat rises. You have this warm air and water rising, but eventually, as you get up higher and higher and higher, that water starts to cool off, right? The air and water starts to cool off. Well, what happens to the water when it starts to cool off that's in the air, all the humidity? It slowly starts to condense, right? And when that water condenses enough, it's going to form clouds and then fall as rain, right? And so really the three components of the water cycle, evaporation, condensation, and precipitation, okay? So you have water being evaporated and it happens most at the equator, but it happens everywhere. All right, that water gets evaporated, and as it rises and cools, it starts to condense, and if it condenses enough, it forms water droplets and falls back to the earth as rain. And that rain then falls, runs back into rivers, lakes, and streams, and we start the cycle all over again, right? Sometimes it can get stuck in these underground pockets of water we call groundwater, right? This underground water. Um, And this is really important. This is where we get a lot of our drinking water is from groundwater, and especially in Rapid City, the water we drink comes from groundwater. These pockets of underground water, like an aquifer, water gets trapped, and then we basically drill down in and then suck it out of the ground. Okay, and so groundwater actually is really, really important. Most of the drinkable water on the planet is found as groundwater. Okay. So that's the water cycle, easy enough. I just want to make sure you understand those three components: evaporation, condensation, and precipitation. Okay. Let's talk about the carbon cycle a little bit. Um, I gave you a little bit of information here just on the slide itself. Okay. The big thing that we're going to be looking at is the atmosphere, right? The atmosphere has carbon in the form of carbon dioxide, CO2. You've heard of that stuff before. It's the stuff you breathe out, right? During photosynthesis, plants and algae and bacteria, they take that carbon from CO2 and they use it to make biomass, sugar, like leaves, stems, different things like that. And so plants make plant material from that carbon dioxide, right, in the process of photosynthesis. And eventually those plants are going to die or get eaten, and they're going to basically transfer that carbon to either the earth if they die, or to another living thing like an animal, a deer, whatever it is, if they get eaten. Okay. What we do then is we eat that plant, and then in the process of eating and our metabolism, eventually we're going to breathe out some of the carbon from that plant as our own CO2, oddly enough, right? And that's called cellular respiration. You remember that from last semester, okay? So we breathe in oxygen, we take in plant material or animal material, and we take the carbon from that, and a lot of it gets used to make our own building blocks for our own cells, but some of it gets breathed out, right? Um, and this also happens in the oceans as well. There's this carbon dioxide exchange that happens with phytoplankton um, in the oceans, and that's actually really, really important. Okay. Now, a lot of this is really, really normal and doesn't really have any impact in terms of like things that would be on scientists' radar specifically. Okay. But as we look at like the greenhouse effect and climate change, scientists are really, really studying this carbon cycle. Why is that? What's the issue? Well, let's look at it a little bit further. Okay. So here's our atmosphere. We have in our atmosphere about 750 billion tons of carbon. Okay, that's a lot of carbon. And we need some of that carbon. If we didn't have carbon in the atmosphere, we would freeze to death. And so it's important we have some. But think of this atmospheric blanket of carbon as our blanket, right? The planet's blanket, right? The thicker that blanket is, the more carbon you have in the atmosphere, the warmer you get, the less you have, the cooler you get. And so there's an optimum, right, for life on this planet about how much carbon you'd want. If you get more than that, your blanket gets too thick and you get too hot. If you get less than that, your blanket gets too thin and you cool off, which is also bad, right? And so we have 750 billion tons of carbon in the atmosphere. One thing that I hope sticks out right away to you is one, well, there's a lot of arrows, but two, there are lots of ways to put carbon in the atmosphere, and there's only a few ways to take it out, right? We talk about why are plants so important. They're really one of the only things that we have to take carbon out of the atmosphere, right? So if our blanket gets too thick and we start getting too warm, we're really relying on plants to help us with um, that process of taking the carbon out of the atmosphere. There is also this carbon dioxide exchange that happens in the oceans. We think of plants being on land, but there's a lot of little small, tiny aquatic living things like diatoms and different phytoplankton that plays a big role here as well. But only a couple ways to take carbon out of the atmosphere, lots of ways to put it in the atmosphere. Okay, so that's kind of worrisome looking at that, right? So how does this carbon cycle work? Well, typically we start up here in the atmosphere. Plants will take in some carbon via carbon dioxide, and they'll make plant material out of it, right? And eventually that vegetation will get eaten by animals, right? Or it'll get burned and put back. But a lot of it gets eaten by animals. Um, and then those animals do their respiration process, and they breathe it out and put it back in the atmosphere. Sometimes those plants just die and decay and they put it back in the atmosphere that way, right? But sometimes some of this plant material, right, if it gets buried in a certain way, um, it'll end up decaying in a specific process and become fossil fuels, things like coal, oil, and gas, right? And you'll notice that that equals about 3,300 billion tons of carbon locked underground as coal, oil, and gas, right? And as long as it stays locked there, you really don't have any major changes to your carbon cycle, right? Forest burning, that stuff's been happening for a long time. Respiration, things have been on this planet for a long time. Um, Breathing, most of this stuff is really normal, right? You look at vegetation with its 600 billion tons, they're storing a lot of carbon for us, keeping it out of the atmosphere. Our soil and organic material is also doing that, right? So this is a really normal process. What isn't so normal is the rate at which we take these fossil fuels out of the ground, and then we burn them and put that carbon back in the atmosphere. And so scientists are studying that, and we're looking closely at as you start to use up and burn and unlock this underground 3,300 billion tons of carbon, is that going to be a problem for our atmosphere or not? And that's what they're studying with climate change and things like that. Okay. You'll notice that the biggest source of carbon is obviously in Earth, right? The material of Earth. You can see a lot of carbon locked as just rocks, essentially, right? But then you can see a lot of it um, in this carbon dioxide exchange as well. Eventually, as carbon goes into the oceans and gets stored in the oceans, it gets locked in these little phytoplanktons and things like that. Eventually, they die, sink to the bottom, and become rock, and then get added to this part here. Okay, but there's a huge component here that we just don't have time to get into and talk about. But there's a lot of carbon in the ocean, more than in the atmosphere. Okay, so hopefully you understand a little about the carbon cycle. The big things I want you to know is um, how do we pull it out of the atmosphere and how do we put it back in the atmosphere? And how is that carbon transferred amongst living things and then non-living things as well? Okay. Phosphorus cycle. The big thing I want you to know about this is it is very, very slow. This is the longest taking cycle. Why? It's dependent on uh, rocks getting eroded, right? And erosion, you guys know, takes a long, long time. And so, uh, how this works is phosphorus is really important for living things. Remember the sugar phosphate backbone of DNA. You also remember that ATP adenosine triphosphate. Phosphate's a big deal. The only way to get phosphorus, though, is to erode it off of rocks, right? Most phosphorus is locked in the rocks. And so you need rain and wind to erode rocks. That phosphorus then gets um, swept into rivers, lakes, and streams. Plants can absorb that from the river's edge or in these bodies of water. Or as those rocks get eroded, that water holding that phosphorus just ends up trickling into the soil, right? And then you get phosphorus in the soil, and then plants can take up that phosphorus. Well, once plants have that phosphorus, they're going to make plant material out of it, leaves, stems, things like that, and then animals will eat that, right? And that's how we get our phosphorus is by eating plants and animals, okay? Well, animals eventually go to the bathroom and put the phosphorus back on the ground, or they die um, and their bodies get decomposed by decomposers, and we put the phosphorus back in the ground that way. Once that rock has been eroded and that phosphorus has been absorbed by plants, this is kind of its own little cycle, right? Plants get eaten by animals, animals die, decompose. Plants then use that decomposed material to make new plants, right? And so on and so forth. This kind of just cycles through. Sometimes, though, that phosphorus will settle out in a river, I guess maybe not a river, but more so like a lake. That phosphorus will settle out, become rock over time, and then eventually, through Earth's processes, those rocks will get uplifted into mountains potentially, where it can then get eroded again and start this over. But again, the erosion of rocks is required for the phosphorus cycle. That takes a long time for it to kick off, okay? So how do you speed that up? Because farmers and ranchers don't always have, thousands or millions of years to wait for rock to get eroded before their plants can get phosphorus. So what do? Well, you add fertilizer, right? That's one of the main components of fertilizer is phosphorus. Um, Farmers will add that onto their crops, and that way they give their plants sort of an instant source of phosphorus to help them grow faster, right? So farmers will speed that process up, but typically the phosphorus cycle takes a long, long time, okay? And this is one where there isn't any phosphorus in the atmosphere. With the water cycle, there's a significant atmospheric component to it. Carbon cycle there is as well. We're going to look at the nitrogen cycle next. It also has a, a large component of it in the atmosphere. But the phosphorus cycle does not, right? It happens in the rocks, right? There's no atmospheric component to this, okay? The nitrogen cycle. As we look at our nitrogen cycle, this one I think is one of the trickier ones to kind of understand. There's a lot of different chemicals, nitrogen compounds we're looking at, things like nitrogen gas, ammonia, nitrite, and nitrate, okay? We saw this in our fish tank, just not this part, right? This was basically food was our nitrogen source. Here, the atmosphere is our nitrogen source. But basically, we saw the same progression in our fish tank, right? And we said that bacteria were a big part of making this cycle happen. Well, that's still going to hold true um, in the nitrogen cycle that happens throughout the planet. Okay, so we have nitrogen gas in the atmosphere, but the thing about this nitrogen gas is these two nitrogen atoms are triple bonded to each other. That is almost impossible to break apart. And if you can't break this stuff apart, you can't use it. And so even though like something like 78% of the air we breathe is nitrogen, we don't do anything with it. And that's because our bodies can't break that triple bonded nitrogen gas down and turn that nitrogen and use those building blocks to make our own stuff. And so that's important, right? So how do you break down this nitrogen? Well, there's really two ways. Lightning can do that. Lightning has enough energy to rip that triple bonded nitrogen apart and turn it into just N. But the only other thing that can do that are these bacteria. We call them nitrogen fixing bacteria. They can break down atmospheric nitrogen and turn it into more usable, user-friendly components or compounds, right? They'll make things like ammonia, right? Things like that. And so bacteria, if I could say anything about the nitrogen cycle, I would say that bacteria is crucial for this cycle to happen. It's very, very important. This is very, very dependent on bacteria. Otherwise, your nitrogen cycle really doesn't get off the ground. Okay. Um, so we have nitrogen fixing bacteria. They're going to turn nitrogen gas into ammonia. Then you have another nitrifying bacteria that will turn ammonia into nitrite, and then another bacteria that can turn nitrite into nitrate. There's a little video down here that kind of helps illustrate this that I really like. I would encourage you to watch it. It is very, very user friendly. It takes a complicated process and explains it at a very, very manageable level. So take a peek at this video. Make sure you click on that in your notes, okay? And so we have the process of taking nitrogen gas into ammonia, into nitrite, and then into nitrate. Plants love this stuff, right? This is usable for plants. And then once plants have used this to make their own tissue, then we can go and eat the plants and then um, uh, eat the plants, and then we can absorb that nitrogen and make our own material out of it, right? Things that we need, like amino acids and things like that. Okay. But eventually, some of this nitrogen doesn't always get used. Some of this nitrate gets converted back into nitrogen gas. We have these things called denitrifying bacteria. Again, a bacterial process that will then take it and they can start the cycle all over again. They convert this stuff back into this, right? Here's kind of a diagram showing that. You have your atmospheric nitrogen, right? You have nitrogen fixing bacteria. Sometimes they're in the roots of certain plants called legumes, things like beans and things like that. And then you have bacteria just naturally found in the soil that are going to take this stuff and convert it into all the things that we need, right? Nitrogen gas into ammonium, then into nitrite, then into nitrate, right? And then plants will assimilate that or use it to make new plant tissue. Sometimes those plants will rot, decompose, and die, and then decomposers will then get that nitrogen and then use it to do stuff. Or animals will eat that plant and then use that nitrogen to build things for themselves, right? And then we said sometimes that the nitrate doesn't all get used up, and then you have denitrifying bacteria that can turn it back into atmospheric nitrogen and start it all over again. Okay. So that's the end of our slides. I want to look at your assignment now. So your assignment, this is supposed to be a coloring diagram. You're not going to be able to do that, obviously, with it being on the computer. But we're going to go through those 4 biogeochemical cycles we're looking at: the water cycle, the carbon cycle, nitrogen cycle, and phosphorus cycle. There's some reading that goes with it. Make sure you read this, okay? Make sure you read and try and understand this diagram. Look at the arrows, what they stand for. What does arrow C stand for, F, those kinds of things, okay? And then you have to answer these questions. So the best thing to do is go here, and then you can just type in red if you want to. You can start typing in your answers to them, okay? And then you'll submit that. That'll be the thing that you submit this week, okay? Do not worry about coloring these things. Just answer the questions and you're good to go. And I've put a page space between each of these. That way it doesn't throw everything off if your answers run off to the next page. Gives you plenty of room, okay? So make sure you go through, read what it says about each cycle, analyze the diagram, answer the questions in bold or red, and then you'll submit this when you're done, okay? So the things you're working on this week: work on and finish your biogeochemical cycles assignment. It'll be due Friday. I will have the quiz posted Thursday, Friday, or Saturday. This will be huge for doing well on your quiz, okay? I think some of you guys maybe aren't spending as much time on your assignments, and then you're just taking the quiz, and that's evident in our scores right now, okay? We're kind of seeing scores all over the place. You should be doing well on these quizzes, okay? So make sure you do the assignment. I'll have the quiz open Thursday if you finish early with the assignment. Otherwise, you can do it Friday or Saturday. You also have your notes. Use your notes. These will be helpful as well. Okay. So you have notes, you have your assignment. You also need to be looking at and working on your final project, the habitat section from biomes. Okay. We want to make sure that we cover this. We're going to start talking about niches and adaptations and relationships next week. Okay. So you know what you're working on. If you have questions, ask. Otherwise, good luck, boys and girls.